The Industrial Revolution is something that anyone who has studied British history of the 19th century or the 18th century is familiar with. It's also part of our popular historical memory. As we'll see, there is a great deal of historical literature, important works of art that are concerned with this phenomenon. It's a very for anyone interested in economic history to understand, because it's the Industrial Revolution, as first starting in 18th and early 19th century England, that is the starting point for the huge increase in human wealth and well-being that we've already looked at. So what I want to do is to say something about what the Industrial Revolution actually was, how it was understood, and what some of the arguments about it are, because the historians who have spent a lot of time thinking about this and researching into it have had a number of pretty intense arguments about the Industrial Revolution, about what was actually going on in Britain at that time, and about how to understand it and how we should evaluate it. And these have very important consequences for how we think about things like economic modernization today. So first of all, let's go through the slideshow in which I'll set out, if you like, what the main issues are. So the question I've got here, which is the very important one, is, well, what actually did happen? People may think they know what we mean when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, but what actually was it? And you'll see here, I've made a play on words here with the two different forms of its. It is, as we'll see, invention, but also in some sense, there's the invention of the very notion of the idea of an industrial revolution. So it was not a contemporary term. During the time when the Industrial Revolution was actually going on, people did not use that term themselves. You didn't find people walking around in 18th century England saying, oh, isn't it amazing, this Industrial Revolution that we are living through? It was actually invented much later, after it was completed, really, in the 1880s by Arnold Toynbee. Not the Arnold Toynbee who wrote the enormous multi-volume history of civilization, but his uncle, a very important founder of the discipline of economic history, who died at the tragically young age of 30, but not before. He'd given a series of lectures which were later published as a book with the title of Lectures on the Industrial Revolution. So he's the person who coined the term. The term was actually invented as a category of historical analysis at that point in the 1830s. Now, the popular view of the Industrial Revolution is that it was a dark time. It was a time of enormous human suffering, enormous environmental damage. Maybe there was economic growth, maybe there was more wealth, but the idea is that there was a terrible price paid for that additional wealth, a price paid in both the exploitation of workers in the dark satanic mills of Lancashire and elsewhere, a price paid in terms of terrible damage done to the environment, and a price paid in an enormous deterioration in the actual living standards of the new urban working classes, the people who had migrated from the countryside to go and live in the new factories of the new industrial era. Now, where does this come from? This picture that we have of the Industrial Revolution, which I think is actually still an extremely powerful one, and one that is still very widely held and shared amongst not just the British public, but the public in a lot of countries. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from contemporary or near contemporary observers originally. People such as the poet Wordsworth, his collaborator and sometime friend Southey, another poet, John Ruskin, the great Victorian art critic and aesthetic philosopher. Also, Friedrich Engels, Marx's friend and collaborator, who gave an account of the terrible living conditions of the working classes in Manchester, where he lived, in his Condition of the English Working Class, one of the great works of social study of that time. There's also Charles Dickens in works like Hard Times and others. More recently, later and after that, you get the work of a number of historians, in particular a husband and wife team, Barbara and John Hammond, in a series of books such as The Town Labourer. Now, one of the things you should notice about that list is that until you get to the Hammonds, most of the people in that list are literary figures. They're not economists, and they're not people from a business background. There are very much people from a literary or poetic background. Also, it's worth saying that not all of the literary figures of that time share the dark view of what was going on that you find in, for example, Charles Dickens. So Charles Dickens's friend, Mrs. Gaskell, wrote the book North and South to give a different view of what was going on to the one that Dickens had painted in Hard Times. But it's fair to say that the bulk of the artists and authors did indeed have this dark view, and people like the Hammonds then developed it. Now, there is another story told about the Industrial Revolution, which is also part of the popular view, and that's the story of the great inventors, James Watt, Robert Stephenson, Richard Arkwright, Samuel Crompton, of the people, new machine, new technology that basically built up the Industrial Revolution. So those are the two kinds of stories. A story of, if you like, exploitation and environmental costs, but also a story of human ingenuity, human invention, the development of new kinds of technology and machinery, which led to a transformation of human life. Now, there's been a huge argument amongst historians. This argument began as early as the 1920s, but it wasn't really finished until late 1970s. It's known as the standard of living debate. And the argument was around the question of whether or not the living standards of workers, the average mass of the population, had gone up or gone down during the Industrial Revolution. And there were two sides, the optimists and the pessimists. The optimists were led by a number of economic historians. In particular, first man on that list, J.H. Clapham, but also T.S. Ashton, W.H. Challoner, Dean and Coles, Phyllis Dean and Martin Coles, a whole lot of people, in fact. On the other side were other historians, notably the well-known Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm. These people, the pessimists, argued that during the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, up to about the 1840s, the average incomes and the living standards of workers, particularly factory workers, had gone down, whereas the optimists argued that in fact they had probably gone up and certainly hadn't gone down. There was no disagreement, by the way, that living standards had risen after 1850. Everyone agreed that they had. The question was what had happened before then. Well, this debate was concluded decisively through a brilliant research paper published by two British economic historians, Peter Lindert and Geoffrey Williamson. And this paper showed absolutely clearly that in fact the incomes of workers had gone up during the early phase of industrialization, and that in fact the incomes of factory workers had been rising more rapidly than those of any other group. The people whose incomes were actually going down at this time were not factory workers, but agricultural laborers, which is one of the reasons why so many of them left the countryside and went to work in the towns. What we've now got, though, is a different argument, which is a debate about whether or not, despite higher incomes, the people in those new towns had a poorer quality of life than they'd had when they lived in the countryside. It is much less clear-cut because there's evidence on both sides of that argument. For example, people's average height, which is usually a good measure of how much food they got and how well they were fed, declined over the same period that their incomes went up. There's also evidence that health deteriorated because of the living conditions in the new industrial towns, the lack of sanitation, the amount of smoke and things of that sort. And so it may well be that there was in fact a decline in quality of life, even if incomes went up. On the other hand, there's a strong case to be said that because of all the things you could now get with those higher earnings, such as much cheaper clothes and fabrics and things of that sort, even allowing for those factors, the quality of life was actually just as good, if not better. But this argument is still going on, and it's much, much more difficult to resolve. So what was the Industrial Revolution? Well, the key is innovation. There were two kinds of innovations in the Industrial Revolution. The obvious ones were the technological ones, the new machinery, the spinning mules, the water frames, the steam engines, all of the other devices and processes that were invented by entrepreneurs, engineers, and applied scientists. There were also organizational innovations, innovations in the way in which production was organized, even if technology was not made it different. If you think about Adam Smith's famous account of the pin factory in The Wealth of Nations, there's no new technology in Smith's story. It's simply a matter of organizing work in a different way. It's very important to realize that the Industrial Revolution didn't happen to all parts of the economy at the same time. Initially, it was very highly sectoral. There are only certain sectors of the economy that really experience this transformation. The three I've listed here: textiles, iron, and coal. Others, like manufacturing in general, come later. They typically come after 1850, in fact. One very important question is how important energy is. The English historian Tony Wrigley, E.A. Wrigley, argues that that is what is actually crucial. The switch from using labor power to using coal, basically fossil fuels, is, he says, critical to what we call the Industrial Revolution. He actually thinks it's more of an energy revolution. Now, I think the general consensus is that actually this is correct, but not for the late 18th or early 19th century. During that period, steam is actually much less important than people realize. In that early phase, it's actually water power that is particularly important in powering the early mills and factories. The big switch to steam power doesn't really come until after 1850. So it's other kinds of energy, very traditional kinds of energy, that are being used before then. It's also important to realize that this is not entirely a factory-driven process. Except in textiles, a very special case of textiles, and particularly cotton, you don't get a big move to factories in the early phase of the Industrial Revolution. What you get is an improvement in the efficiency and output of small workshops. And as late as 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition, the great majority of British manufacturing still takes place in small workshops employing a small number of people. It's only iron founding and particularly textiles that have really moved on to large plants by that date. The really big move into big factories comes much later, after 1870. Now, what made it possible? Well, first of all, there are certain techniques, things like double entry bookkeeping, proper accounting, which enable you to work out how much profit you're making and how much return you're making on capital. And the argument is that it was the invention of these things that made the Industrial Revolution feasible. Now, certainly that's true. But the problem is that these things had been around for hundreds of years. So double entry bookkeeping and proper accounting had been invented by the Italians right back in the late 12th, early 13th century. So things like that were necessary. You couldn't have had the Industrial Revolution without them, but they were not sufficient. They didn't cause it by themselves. There had to be something else. The same is true for legal institutions, such as property rights, for example. Again, these have been around for hundreds of years before the Industrial Revolution happened. So although you couldn't have had it without secure property rights, they can't be the whole story, because obviously, had that been the only story, we would have had an Industrial Revolution, say, in the reign of Elizabeth I, and not had to wait until the later part of George III's reign. Another common argument is that it's to do with the profits of the slave trade and slave plantations. The argument is that it's the profits made out of slavery and the slave trade which are then used to finance the Industrial Revolution and build the mills. Quite simply, this is false. If you look at the sources of capital for investment in industry in the period of the Industrial Revolution, 1750 to 1840 roughly, less than 10% of it comes from the profits of slave plantations and the slave trade. That's less than the profits from trade with India and China, which amount to about 20% of it, and it comes a long way behind what is by far the biggest source of capital, which is profits from domestic agriculture, which accounts for almost exactly half of all the capital invested. But perhaps increasingly seen as important, something that made it happen and made it possible, is what's been called a culture of innovation and tinkering. The two historians who have written most about this and who have the biggest insights into it are particularly an American historian called Joel Mokyr, who came up with this expression, and also more recently, a young British historian, Anton Howes, who's looked at the growth of the network of innovators in the late 18th and early 19th century. What we're talking about here is certainly one of the most important events in human history. It's an event that happened, first of all, in Britain, but which then spread from Britain to the rest of the world. It's important that you understand what it was and what it was not. It was not a transformation of the economy as a whole. It was much slower than the term revolution, perhaps, actually suggests. It was not driven initially by steam power, but perhaps more by water power, particularly in places like the north of England. And it was initially very much a phenomenon of certain parts of the economy, above all textiles, but also a number of others, such as railways, lastly, iron and coal. But that's not to understate the degree of the impact that it had. This was seen by people living at the time as being a truly transformed. The point or the popular view of what happened is still excessively influenced by the reaction to it of early 19th century authors and poets. Actually, living standards, contrary to the view that people like Charles Dickens gave, did not decline during the early phase of industrialization. The living standards of people who moved to the towns and became factory workers were actually rising at a historically unprecedented rate. Their living conditions may not have been very good by modern standards, in fact terrible by modern standards, but they were still in many ways better than the ones they had left behind in the countryside. And even though we may say that in some ways were worse off because they had, for example, polluted air and water as opposed to relatively clean air and water, in terms of other things, such as the number of goods they had access to and the range of things they could do, they were better off. So in general, we should welcome the Industrial Revolution. We should see it as an enormous breakthrough and boon to humanity, not for us, its inheritors and heirs, but also for the people at the time.